The horror of the Sudanese civil war is not exhausted by the enumeration of its atrocities, though those alone are staggering. Mass killings, ethnic cleansing, systematic rape, the razing of villages, famine used as a weapon, and the deliberate destruction of the conditions of life. What distinguishes Sudan's catastrophe, stretching from earlier civil wars through Darfur and into present conflict between rival military powers, is not only the scale of suffering, but the way violence has become structural, embedded in the very organizations of political power. The war is not merely a breakdown of order, it is a triumph of a particular perception of order itself. At the center lies a grim philosophical insight. When power is divorced from accountability, violence ceases to be instrumental and becomes expressive. In Sudan's armed actors, whether state forces or militia, do not simply commit atrocities, they do so in pursuit of clear political ends. Violence itself becomes the message. One of the central principles of just war theory is discrimination. Combatants may be targeted, civilians must not. In Sudan, this distinction has broken down. Markets, funeral homes, hospitals, schools, and refugee camps, all civilian spaces, have been repeatedly attacked. Drone strikes on gatherings such as funerals and children in home exemplify indiscriminate violence that fails to distinguish between combatant and not combatant. The moral and military failure signifies a war that treats human beings as interchangeable obstacles rather than as persons with intrinsic dignity. The burning of villages, the targeting of civilians, and the siege and the erasure of entire communities are not accidental excesses. They are ways of asserting dominance in a space where legitimacy no longer matters. Starvation and the denial of humanitarian access becomes weapons to coerce compliance. The displacement of entire populations and casualty counts serve as justifications for further escalation. The moral breakdown. This instrumental logic corrodes moral agency. The victims are no longer persons whose rights must be respected, but strategic variables in an intermittent game of gain and loss. Power announces itself through terror because terror is the only remaining currency. Instead of protecting civilians in Sudan, we witness an ethical inversion. The very actors claiming to secure territorial or political ends are the ones perpetuating harm to the basic conditions of life, safety, nourishment, shelter, health, and growth. Extrajudicial killing, rape, and mass displacement are not accidental byproducts. They are recurring patterned actions in the conflict that signal the erosion of moral defense. The collapse of distinction between means and ends. This is why the Sudanese civil war resists confronting narrative of a tragedy or misunderstanding. What we see instead is what Hannah Arendt once described as the collapse of the distinction between means and ends. The prospect of future peace no longer justifies killing. It is a political practice. The result is a form of nihilism that is not abstract in the academic sense, but brutally material. The reduction of a human being to obstacles, resources, or threat to be eliminated. Nowhere was this clear than in Darfur, where ethnic identity became a death sentence and entire populations were murdered. This makes the annihilation of the idea of shared world, because recognizing another as a human is to acknowledge that they have the right to inhabit the same moral space as oneself, that their suffering makes a claim on us. Genocidal violence. Genocidal violence, by contrast, is an attempt to erase that claim altogether. It is not simply murder. It is the denial that the victim overcounted as a bearer of meanings of value. The current phase of the war, marked by fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, deepens this horror by exposing the emptiness at the heart of militarized sovereignty. These factions represent rival monopolies on coercion. Civilians are crushed not because they stand in the way of a noble project, but because their lives are irrelevant to the calculus of power. This is a domination stripped of even the pretense of ideology. Where do we go from here? Sudan poses a terrifying question. What remains of ethic when political sphere becomes an arena of total irresponsibility? In such conditions, guilt is diffuse, accountability evaporates, and atrocity becomes trite. Violence no longer shocks, it normalizes itself. This is perhaps the most insidious horror of all. Not that human beings are capable of cruelty, but that cruelty and violence can become routine, administered, and legitimized by identity, faction, or territory. Stories of atrocities are reported, but often overshadowed by geopolitics. The innocent become instrument, not an end. This erosion represents not merely a policy failure, but a failure of moral responsibility. The inability to see, quote, the other as oneself. Several countries that supply warring parties with killing machines are complicit in the calamitous war in Sudan. The SAF receives support from Iran, Egypt, and Russia, while the RSF is being armed primarily by the UAE. Weapons manufacturers in China, Russia, Turkey, and Serbia have been found in the country. Instead of arming the two factions, Turkey and the UAE in particular, to try to mediate between the warring parties and to stop a genocidal war that neither side can win. Short of that, it is time for the United Nations Security Council to adopt punitive actions against these countries, including expansion of the UN arms embargo with economic sanctions on violating states, firms and individuals, imposing secondary sanctions on banks, shippers, and logistic companies moving Sudan-bound arms, using targeted asset freezes travel ban and ICC and UN investigation to raise legal and reputational costs for officials authorizing transfers, launching coordinated sanctions targeting companies and sovereign wealth funds involved in Sudan-linked arms deals. To confront Sudan honestly is to abandon the illusion that history bends automatically toward justice. It is to recognize that without institutions capable of responsibility, power tends toward annihilation. The Sudanese civil war is a warning written in blood.